There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store.
And so Jesus, He looks at these scribes and Pharisees who are claiming their own self-righteousness by keeping the law, and He doesn't accept it because He knows it's just a facade. They're all just self-deceived. So when Jesus says here in verse 20 that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. So this crowd, they would have been looking at Jesus and they would have been astounded. They would have been stumped because the Pharisees, well, they were the holiest men in the whole community because they're the ones who defended God's laws. And people would think, well, we could never obtain to their standard of character. We could never be that good. And if they can't make it to heaven by their behavior, is there any hope for us at all? Because the Pharisees, they would be keeping this law perfectly, and they would even be tithing from their herb gardens. And what a tithe is it's a tenth. And it was required for everyone to give a tenth to the Lord of their increase from God. So these Pharisees, what they would do, they would count out 9 seeds of little tiny seeds of spices, and they'd count 9 for themselves, and then they take the 10th one, then they set it aside, and they're going to give it to God as an offering in the temple. And they did that with everything. And so these people, they wouldn't have been able to understand at that time that by Jesus's fulfilling of the law, that He was actually going to impart His very own righteousness to His followers, and that their salvation, well, it wasn't going to be on their own merits, but it was going to be on His merits, on Christ's merits. But these Pharisees, they were basing their righteousness before God on their own feeble attempts to keep the law. But their keeping of the law was only physical. It was only external. It wasn't internal. So the law found them guilty because how the Pharisees acted, well, that wasn't who they really were. They were only acting righteous. They weren't being righteous. It was only acting. And that's why later Jesus, He calls them hypocrites, because that word hypocrite comes from the Greek word hypokrisis, which is the Greek word for an actor. It was one who wore a mask. It's like in a Greek play. They were just pretending that they were somebody that they weren't. We've all seen those white masks, the ones with the big smile or the big frown that they use for the symbol of drama. But for these people, they only saw the Pharisees for how they acted. But Jesus, He saw them for who they are, and He saw them the way that the people couldn't see them. So Jesus, He goes on to expose the scribes and the Pharisees for who they really are. But as Jesus does this, He also exposes us, because inside of all of us, we have a living Pharisee hiding in our own hearts, because we all have a sense of our own self-righteousness, and especially when we compare ourselves to each other. Because when we compare ourselves to each other, we always look good, because we're always only comparing ourselves to other people's shortcomings. And then Jesus, He starts to explain how these Pharisees looked at the law wrong. because Jesus, he wasn't going to accept their artificial righteousness. He wasn't going to accept this fake religious righteousness as being real righteousness, because their outlook on righteousness made them proud, not humble. They led people into bondage, not liberty. And these guys, they were always railing on Jesus for breaking the law. But Jesus, he never broke God's law, but he wasn't going to support their legalism, their own man-made laws, but because they were burdening men as if it was God doing that. Because you have to remember, Jesus, he is the friend of sinners. But these guys, they hated sinners, and their religion was just a bunch of dead rituals. And Jesus, he didn't destroy the law by fighting it. Jesus destroyed the law by fulfilling it. And Jesus, he didn't fulfill the law for himself because he didn't have to, because he didn't need to, because he didn't have any sin. But he fulfilled it for us. And that's because we had no hope in fulfilling it for ourselves. And by Jesus fulfilling the law, it was no longer required by God's people because Jesus fulfilled it for us. And Jesus, he fulfilled the law all the way down to paying the ultimate price for our sin that was required by the law. And he paid it with his life. He paid for our death. So Jesus, he didn't come to abolish the law. He came to fulfill it. And the only way that we can fulfill the law is by receiving Jesus and what he did for us. So Jesus, he starts to teach his disciples, and he begins with the big one, the big sin of them all. He begins with the sin of murder. And Jesus starts and he says, you heard it said from those of old. And where it says the people heard it said, it's because these people, they never studied the law for themselves. They never read the law. They were only told about the law and about what the law says. And so they only knew the interpretation of the law that was told to them in the way that it was given to them by these scribes and by these Pharisees. And Jesus, by saying it was an old saying, it didn't mean that it was a true saying. And what the Pharisees had actually been teaching is that anything short of murder is all right, or at least it's allowed. And Jesus here, he isn't saying that anger is as bad as murder, or that anger and murder, that they're the same thing, but that anger is the beginning of murder. And all of this starts in the heart. And if you have this unjustified anger in your heart, you're in danger of murder. And what this makes me think of, it makes me think of the very first murder. It makes me think of the murder of Abel by his brother Cain, because I think that perfectly illustrates this point where Cain, he was angry with Abel without cause, and he was warned by God, but he didn't listen to God. And we see this all happening again right here with all these religious leaders, with all this anger that's in their hearts that they have toward Jesus, and it's all without any cause. And they're eventually going to murder him. And when you hate somebody, well, it's actually that you already did kind of murder them already in your heart. So all murders, well, they've been committed in the heart long before they're ever physically carried out. And so we're told that this anger in the state of our heart can put us in danger of hellfire. In this state of our heart, it can also be heard or revealed by how we speak. Like when you say, you fool, you're revealing the state of your heart. You're revealing your anger, and you're in danger of hell. And that word that he uses there, raka, and what raka means, it means empty-headed or idiot or bonehead. And it's really a word in Greek that's really almost untranslatable, because even though it's a derogatory term, it's said by the way it sounds. It's kind of like us going, duh, raka, so it's like, it's making someone out to being stupid. But then when you get to the place where you say, you fool, you're not only calling somebody stupid, but you're calling them a rebel. So Jesus, he goes on and he says, well, if you found yourself having this anger or envy and you're speaking evil of someone and you realize that you sinned against somebody and you just happen to be in church and you're just about to give your offering, well, and at this time it wouldn't have been a church, it would have been a temple, it would have been the temple, and your offering, it would have been an animal sacrifice. But Jesus is telling you to go make it right with the person you offended before you make that sacrifice. Because reconciliation is more important than sacrifice. In fact, your sacrifice isn't going to do you any good until you make it right. Because you can't be right with God and be sinning against your brother. And Jesus isn't saying don't give an offering, but he says get yourself right first so that your offering is accepted. And so when you come to this realization about your sin, Jesus is also saying that you need to go and you need to do this quickly, because the longer you wait, the greater the bondage will be for you. And there's a lot of suffering that you can have. And a prison, we all have a prison in our mind where we will keep taking the same thing and the same hurts, and we'll just go over and over and over. So our minds can be these prisons because we haven't done right, or we haven't repented, and we haven't taken care of sins that we have against others. And he's saying there is a judge coming, but it's not Judge Judy. But if you make peace with your adversary before the judge comes, there will be nothing to judge. And then Jesus, he goes on and he says again, you have heard it said of those of old, you shall not commit adultery. And so Jesus is starting again about what they have heard, which is the interpretation of their leaders of what they had taught them about adultery. And what they had taught, what the Pharisees had taught about adultery, that the act was wrong, but not the heart of the act. And Jesus here again isn't saying that adultery in the heart is the same thing as the act. Or since you lusted in your heart, you might as well go out and commit the act. But what Jesus is addressing is the Pharisees' self-righteousness. Because if you're lusting to satisfy an inner desire, and even though you don't commit the act of adultery, it's still sin and it still breaks the law, even if you haven't acted on it physically. And adultery, just like murder, it's always committed in the heart before it's ever carried out physically. And the sin of adultery, it's never an accident, but it always occurs in a person's heart first. And so then Jesus, he gives us a remedy. And this remedy, it sounds absurd. And it's the suggestion of cutting off your right hand or plucking out your right eye as if that's what caused you to sin. But Jesus isn't asking us to do that, because that's never what causes us to sin. What causes us to sin is our hearts. And how do you pluck out a heart?
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.